bow your heads. I've always wanted to say that. I think that my inner evangelical preacher just comes out when I get in front of audiences of unreconstructed heathens and fence centers and others. Welcome. And thank you to the Center for Inquiry for having me this morning. I am going to frame the majority of my comments vis-a-vis the political turbulence that this country is experiencing, the extreme, grave, egregious backlash against civil and human rights, and also look at this in terms of the intersection of humanism, feminism, contemporary politics, and cultural relevance. So I'm going to begin with an evocation of these questions as it pertains to the lived experiences of my students. I teach in South LA high schools. I've developed a young women's leadership project that really focuses on building bridges between young African American and Latina women, focusing on their cultural capital, their cultural knowledge, and their connection to the collective struggle of social justice that they have forged, that unfortunately they've been disenfranchised from. In 1781, black and brown women and men founded the city of Los Angeles. In this so-called city without a history, legend has it that undocumented Anglos were the real OG illegals. A few years before, a new revolution in what it meant to be human unfolded on the opposite shore in the British colonies. My students know the romance of the American Revolution, but not the secret of Los Angeles. In the prison house of textbook history, they know each other as enslaved niggers and wetback interlopers. Growing up in the same neighborhoods, elbow to elbow, cheek by jowl, they are taught to believe that black and Latino culture can be distilled down to media stereotypes, to get rich or die trying hip-hop and ghetto dysfunction, big Catholic families, and job-stealing illegals. As kindergartners, they were taught to cite the Pledge of Allegiance as sacred chapter and verse, hand solemnly over heart, in homage to royal theft. Founding myths of heroic white men bootstrapping to liberty are intimately bound to their imagination of the classroom, to its rhythm of shrill discipline and stench of ground chalk, to a regime of time in which white supremacy and narratives of progress are the currency of American faith. Over the past few decades, progressive education reform activists have reshaped the dialogue about the so-called achievement gap in public schools. Culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogy that builds on the lived experiences, cultural knowledge, language, and worldviews of children of color have become a standard, if still controversial, approach to addressing race and class disparities in education. Culturally relevant pedagogy rejects myths of meritocracy, colorblindness, and exceptionalism. At its most radical, it critiques institutional structures of racist power and control that render children of color invisible within mainstream curriculum and instruction. It is based on the view that the question of what it means to be moral, to be a citizen, and to be human is implicit within the politics of education. So how does cultural relevance relate to radical humanism? What is the connection between humanism and social justice in the so-called post-racial era? After President Obama's election, the mainstream media giddily trumpeted post-racialism as the new norm. There was much speculation about whether, say, Black History Month, long commodified and domesticated as a quick and dirty way to pay homage to the other, was still relevant. Was it redundant now that there was an African-American first family in the White House and Sasha and Malia were the new girls next door? But of course, no one ever caricatured Bill Clinton, backslapping, rib-eating, good old boy, philandering Bill Clinton as a bone-in-the-nose, bongo-playing savage or the son of apes. And no one ever caricatured Hillary Clinton as an ape or missing link. Yet, of course, these were some of the images that prevailed after the election. And these images underscored that we are still, to use the parlance of Bell Hooks, an African-American feminist activist, that we are still a white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy that the U.S. has not suddenly morphed into this exceptional, colorblind, post-racial democracy. And in fact, as we know, many white folk woke up after the election and proclaimed that the end times were upon us, that the dark clouds of apocalypse had descended, and that we needed to take back our country. And so, egregiously enough, some white liberal pundits and even some white progressives assessed this backlash as a populist backlash that was oddly lacking in people of color. Instead of assessing the backlash, as many pundits of color did, as a white nationalist insurgency. And according to public religion research, a majority of Americans believe that God has conferred the United States with a special place, a special destiny in history. And speaking before a group of homeschoolers, former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, who's also a presidential hopeful, framed this discontent this way. He said, "You have been given a great gift in living in the greatest country in the history of the world, but that freedom, that equality, that exceptionalism is at stake right now if we do not replace the current president." And this notion that exceptionalism is under attack is exemplified by the backlash that we have seen against health care reform, against undocumented immigrant rights, against family planning, abortion rights, gender justice, public employee unionism, and in short, the very foundation of social welfare in the United States. Also in this poll, the Public Religion Research Survey indicated that 44% of Americans believe that discrimination against whites has become just as bad as that against minorities. 75% of those who identify with the Tea Party believe this to be true, and a majority of those who characterize themselves as Christian evangelicals believe this to be true, white Christian evangelicals. A new survey has come out which has concluded that many whites now believe that they are the primary targets of racism in the United States. And so what does it mean in this toxic political climate to be an African-American humanist and atheist, and how have race, gender, class, and morality intersected with each other in terms of this hijacking of public morality? I want to put this in some historical and intellectual context. In 1927, A. Philip Randolph, civil rights organizer, socialist, and humanist, sponsored this interesting essay writing contest for his journal, The Messenger. And The Messenger was one of the premier radical black journals of the era. And the essay writing contest was called, "Is Christianity a Menace to the Negro?" To repeat, is Christianity a menace to the Negro? Now, again, this was the late 1920s. And it's a theme that is really inconceivable in this era of black hyper-religiosity and prayer cult nation hysteria. But the late 1920s was a period in which there were, quote, commies lurking behind every bedpost, and it was better to be dead than red. Political radicals were associated with godlessness, and vice versa. And Randolph was constantly being investigated for his so-called politically seditious activities. Also during this period, 1928, Nella Larson, the Harlem Renaissance author, writes her landmark work, Quicksand, which is one of the first explicitly skeptic black feminist critiques of the stifling gender norms of the black church.